Velkommen til det her DIGO Alumne Event, som er lidt uden for vores sædvanlige nummer, men vi har glædet os rigtig meget til at holde den her dag. Om lidt vil Martin Elsmann introducere Richard. Men lige først vil jeg lige gøre opmærksom på, at vi jo altid holder en årlig DIGO Alumne-dag, og jeg har skrevet en mailadresse her. Måske kan I se den. alumni.digo.dk, hvis I gerne vil inviteres til næste DIGO Alumne-dag, som er 26. september. Så jeg giver ordet videre til Martin Elsmann, DIGO.
Yes, I will switch into English. Welcome everyone to this event hosted by DIGO and DIGO Business Club. Our speaker today is a person who had a tremendous influence on how many of us develop and use software. He's the founding developer of DCC and of GDB and gnu+linux, the powerful editor many of us use. He's the author of the GNU General Public License, and he's the president of the Free Software Foundation. Today he will be talking about computing, freedom, and privacy. Please welcome Dr. Richard Stallman.
Well, thanks for the introduction, but you left out the most important two things. I launched the development of the GNU operating system, and I launched the free software movement. And each of those is bigger than the various things that you mentioned. Those are the things that are really important. But at first I've got to explain some things about photos and recordings. So, if you might want to take photos of me or with me, and that's okay, but there are some conditions. First of all, don't put any photo that shows me into Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, because those are three mouths of the same surveillance monster, and it knows how to recognize people from their faces or the backs of their heads. So if you put a photo into that monster by any of its mouths that shows a person, you are helping it track and surveil that person, which is doing wrong to that person. You shouldn't help. That's a bad way to treat your friends, and please don't do that to me. Second, if you want to take a photo of me with a mobile device, remember that mobile devices normally put the geolocation into the metadata of the photo. And then if you distribute a copy of that photo, no matter how, whoever gets the copy can see where I was at the time. So if you want to take a photo with a mobile device, including me, please turn off the feature of saving geolocation and metadata. Turn it off before you approach me to take the photo. Don't take up my time by preparing. Just prepare first. And finally, if you do those two things, it's okay to take a photo of me, provided you do not ask. Those questions take up time and they're boring. And with 5 talks this week, I am very overloaded. So help me do my work for the movement. Is anyone here except the professionals planning to make an audio or video recording? Please raise your hand. Okay, I don't need to explain this carefully, but if you were to make a recording and distribute copies, please make sure the distribution website does not require people to run any non-free JavaScript code before they can download a copy, in order to download a copy. And please put on it the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, I'm going to start by talking mainly about free software. Hello. Why is is it not responding to me now? It was working before. There's got to be another way to get into full screen mode. Okay. So, what is free software? This is going to start by talking about free software, which is the basis of this issue, but not all of the issue. So what is free software? It's free in the sense of freedom. Free software is software that respects your freedom and your community. So we mean free in the sense of freedom, not in the sense of price. Whether you pay to get a copy of the program or not is a side issue. We're not really concerned with that because it doesn't affect the right and wrong of the situation. We're concerned with how the program treats you once you have a copy, regardless of how you got the copy. Does it respect your freedom or does it crush your freedom? Does it respect your community or does it divide the people in your community? Those are important moral issues about software. So that's how we judge what's right and wrong. So, in English, the word free is ambiguous. I have to clear up what it means by explaining with the French word libre or the Spanish word libre, or, I'm not sure whether in Danish the word free only refers to freedom. I'm sad to say I saw the word in use meaning gratis. And that's creating a confusion I hope you'll fight against. I make a point when speaking English, never to use the word free to refer to price. When I want to say that the price of something is zero, I call it gratis or I call it zero price. So when I say free, you know I'm talking about freedom. But what is a program? What is a computer? A computer is a universal computing engine. But conceptually, it's very simple. It can only do one thing. Get the next instruction and do what that says. Then get another instruction and do what that says. And the next, millions of times per second, it will get the next instruction and do what that instruction says. The instructions come from a program, which is a bunch of instructions. And depending on what instructions that program contains, it will direct your computer to do this or that or that or that or that or that or that, or almost an infinity of other things. In fact, the right program could direct your computer, the same computer, to do anything whatsoever except for the things that are impossible. So this raises the moral question of who gives the instructions to your computer. You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. You might think that your computer is obeying you, when really it's always obeying its true master. And it does what you want, what you ask for, if the true master gives permission, and otherwise it doesn't. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other, because there's no other possibility. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why so? Well, what is freedom? Freedom is having control of your own life, having control of the activities you do in your life. But if you use programs to do the activities, control of the activity requires control of the programs, control of what they do. So, When the users have control of the program, that program respects users' freedom and community, so it's free software. Practically speaking, in order for users to have this control, they need the 4 essential freedoms, which make the practical criterion for free software. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so it does your computing activities the way you wish. Why do we make a point of mentioning source code? Well, on the left is some source code. Source code is a mixture of English and math. And if you've learned that programming language, you can read it, understand it, and then change it to do something different. But in order to run it, we typically convert it into executable software, which is an enigmatic series of 1s and 0s, which stand for instructions. But it's not easy to figure out what the instructions mean. If a program is this tiny, it wouldn't be a big job. A programmer could look up in the description of the instructions what instructions those 1s and 0s mean and figure out what they would do. But for a bigger program, it starts to get hard. And for a realistic program with maybe 50 or 100 million 1s and 0s, it gets to be really hard to figure out what those instructions will do. It's so hard people don't even consider trying, except as a last resort in a situation of desperation. So if the users get only the executable, telling them, you're free to change this executable if you could figure out what it does, that's not respecting their freedom, that's mockery of freedom. This is why in stating freedom 1, we insist that the users get the source code. These 2 essential freedoms together give us separate control over the program. That means I'm free to change my copies and you're free to change your copies. Here's an example of separate control. 4 users using the same program. Each one is free to change per copies, and one of them is doing so, the other 3 are not. Well, this separate control is absolutely vital, but it's not enough to give all users control over their computing, because most users are not programmers. They don't know how to study and change source code because they have other talents, other skills, they do other things. I don't agree with the people who say that everybody's supposed to learn how to program, because I know that only some people are good enough at it to be able to take advantage of that for practical needs. But even though these people's fields are not programming, they deserve control over their computing. They deserve freedom in what they do. How can they have it? We have to go beyond separate control to collective control, which is the freedom to work together with other users to exercise control over what the program does. At the top, we see a group of 3 users who are collaborating in this way. The 2 on the right are touching the code. They must be programmers. The one on the left is not. Maybe that user doesn't know how to program, but is participating in the control over what that program does, because the users that are working together discuss together what changes to make. And that's where the non-programmers can have an influence. Those who collaborate in this way are those who choose to. At the bottom, we see 2 more users of the same program who are not working with that group, and they're using the original version. Why are they not working together? Well, it could be any reason. Maybe they dislike each other and one doesn't trust the others, or maybe they get along just fine, but they have different ideas of what they want this program to do. Maybe they don't know each other. Maybe tomorrow they'll get in touch and decide to work together, or not. The point is they're all free to work together with others when they wish. This collective control requires two more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies and give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. This permits the group to cooperate, because if one member of the group makes a modified version, with freedom 3, person can make copies of that and distribute them to others in the group. Then those users, through freedom 2, can make more copies and distribute them to others in the group. However, the group is not required to have a legal structure or a name or a list of members. Whichever users are working together today, they're a group and these freedoms apply to them. So freedoms 2 and 3 are not limited in regard to who you can redistribute to. You can redistribute to whoever wants a copy if you wish. You can even offer copies to the general public if you wish, which means publishing that version. You're free to do that under freedom 2. So, if the program carries these 4 essential freedoms, then it is free software. So the users control the program, and thus it respects their freedom and community. And I'll repeat the 4 essential freedoms because they're an absolutely vital point. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so it does your computing activities the way you want it to do. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies and redistribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So these are the criteria, and if the program gives you all these 4 essential freedoms, then it's free software. But if one of these freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the users do not have control of the program, so it's not free software. Instead, the program controls the users and the owner controls the program. So through that program, the owner exercises power over the users of the program. This is why a non-free program is an injustice. It creates a system of unjust power. Power for the owner of the program over its users. This is why the non-free program, by existing, makes the world a more unjust place, a worse place. This is why non-free software should not exist. This is why non-free software is an injustice. This is why, for your own freedom's sake, you should escape from non-free software. This is why you shouldn't develop non-free software. You see, developing non-free software is creating more injustice. It's wrong to do that. Now, there are some excuses we can accept. For instance, if someone points a gun at you and says, "Write this non-free software or I'll shoot," I would forgive you for going along until you can escape. But I hope you will make that non-free program work very badly. That would be the right thing to do in the circumstances if you can. it's much better to do nothing at all than develop non-free software. Because developing non-free software is doing harm to the world, whereas if you're doing nothing, at least you're not doing harm. That's a step up. So this is the inherent injustice of any non-free program, but it's not the only injustice. This one leads to others, because nowadays the owner of the non-free program recognizes the power that it exercises over the users, so it feels the temptation to use that power to push the users down even more by putting in malicious functionalities to mistreat those users and thus gain more money or more power at their expense. So non-free software tends to contain malicious functionalities. For instance, spying on the user. Most non-free programs, it appears, nowadays spy on their users. They are malware. This example is the Amazon Swindle, Amazon's ebook reader. It sends the title of the book to Amazon servers. So even if the user got the book from someplace else, it still informs Amazon that the user is reading that book. And it sends the page number to Amazon servers. If the user highlights any text or enters any notes, that's sent to Amazon too. It's total Orwellian surveillance of what the user does. I call it the Amazon Swindle because it's designed to swindle readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books. But it's not alone. The 5 main proprietary operating systems, that means Windows, macOS, Android, iOS, and Chromos, all spy on the users, each sending in its own way personal data to the manufacturer. And lots of application programs spy on users. Also, somebody did an investigation of, I think, more than 1,000 of the most popular Android apps, and found that of the paid apps, 60% were spying on the user, and of the gratis apps, 90% were spying. Now, the investigator could only detect one method of spying, because the programs could be sending personal data in other ways, but which the investigator couldn't detect without the source code. All these programs were non-free. But there was one method which was so easy to detect that that's what the investigator studied. And those are the figures I gave you. So the rest of the apps could be spying in other ways that are not so easy to detect. But in any case, this is more than half. This demonstrates that in the world of user subjugating software, spying on people is the usual case. It's not the exception. But that field has become thoroughly corrupt. But the worst cases are things like streaming apps and transportation apps. For instance, Spotify makes users identify themselves. And since it only works with one server, that server can then keep a dossier for each user about what that user has listened to. This surveillance is a threat to human rights and democracy. We need laws to put a stop to it. We need to make sure that companies like Spotify can't find out what a person listened to. But that requires the app to be free software so that users can have control over it. The same for Netflix. I have refused ever to use either of those. I won't even listen to a song through Spotify running in someone else's computer. I won't watch a video through Netflix running on someone else's computer. I'm not willing to allow them to be treated as acceptable parts of life, at least not my life. And then there are the transportation apps like Uber and Lyft, which make users identify themselves, at least to pay, and then they keep dossiers of where users have gone. Well, keeping track of people's movements in this way is the foundation for repression. We must not allow companies to keep track of where individuals are going. And likewise, I regard Uber as a threat to my rights, and therefore I actively do whatever I can to put an end to Uber. I won't get into an Uber car even if someone else is the customer, because we have to do all we can to make sure Uber can't eliminate other options, and that's what Uber intends to do. Uber runs at a loss, a big loss of money every year, but that is an investment in the hoped-for future monopoly. By the way, in regard to talking to a particular server, that's the standard way nowadays to design products for the Internet of Stings. I call them stings because each product is a trap. And some of them are being forced on people. But you see, the way they work is they communicate to a server, the same server. The user has no choice about that. And if the user can give the machine commands, they go through that same server, which means that server spies on everything. The Fitbit was the first case I knew about. It would send the user's personal data to the company, which offered to sell the data back to the user. What nerve! If people had a decent sense of refusing to be suckered, they would have made the company fail. And then lots of other products were set up that way. For instance, thermostats and home controllers and camera Wi-Fi add-ons and cooking devices, doorbells, home security cameras are for sale that work this way. And sometimes you don't even get a choice about them. They're installing smart electric meters in Denmark, and these allow reading the meter every hour or maybe more often, which means they can surveil the way you live your life. And this is totally inexcusable. There is no legitimate justification for the device to permit that. To charge you for your electricity, they don't need to know what you use each hour. They only need to know what you use each month. So that the law should require them to design the devices so that they can only find out what you've used each month, or maybe twice a month in case people are moving in and out frequently. So I consider those devices an injustice. I'd be inclined to get some kind of battery power supply so that some of the time I could disguise from them the fact that I was in my house, a fact that they have no right to know. And of course, the manufacturer spies on everything. When the device is called smart, here, spy. This is a spy thermostat. This is a spy cooker. This is a spy camera. It will help you understand and not forget what's really going on. There is even a sex toy that was designed to accept commands from somebody else over the internet, which could be an enjoyable functionality in some situations. But of course, those commands pass through the manufacturer's server, which means the manufacturer knows all the commands and knows whatever responses are being sent. And I expect, I don't know for certain, I expect it arranges to identify who the other person is. So it knows who's making love with whom through this device and how. And this was not an afterthought. The device was designed with that purpose in mind. We know this because the manufacturer put in a thermometer. Why do you want a thermometer in your sex toy? So you could also use it to see if you have a cold? No. The purpose of the thermometer is so the manufacturer can tell if the product is in contact with a human body. And I suspect it can also tell just how the device is in contact with a human body. So that's in the physical design. It was designed for that purpose. That shows how nasty the spying of these devices is, and shows that the lack of goodwill and respect on the part of the manufacturers. The other nasty thing they can do with their server is shut it off. Sometimes the company decides we're not making enough money anymore from that particular product line, so it's not worth the cost of keeping the server running. Let's turn it off. And when that happens, all those products stop working. And this has happened with many products already. Microsoft designed an ebook reader that depends on contacting a Microsoft server for each book that the user starts to read, but Microsoft decided to turn off that server, so those books are going to be impossible to read. And that brings me to another malicious functionality, Digital Restrictions Management, DRM. That's the functionality of refusing to let you do what you want to do. And I'm not talking about a feature that wasn't implemented. They go to a lot of work to make sure you can't do these things that they don't want you to do. We also call these things digital shackles. This example is the infamous Blu-ray that attacks users who want to copy. Well, that's comedic license. It's not an actual Blu-ray, and it doesn't actually hit your body and cause injury. No, it causes pain by stopping you from copying what's on the disc. Now, I adopted a rule many years ago that if a product was designed to restrict me, then I will never use it unless I have whatever is needed in order to break the shackles. So if someday I have what's needed to copy Blu-ray discs freely, I might start using Blu-ray discs. But until that time, I will never use one. I have never used one. Because the resentment I feel towards the injustice of that system makes me lose any wish to watch whatever movie it might be. I value my freedom more than watching any and all of the movies ever made. And we need to value freedom more in order not to lose it. By the way, all 5 of the main proprietary operating systems implement the base for DRM, and then many apps use that base to impose these digital shackles. And the Amazon swindle, of course, imposes digital shackles. There are also back doors. A backdoor listens for commands coming from somebody else, commands telling it to do something nasty to you. It's generally something nasty, because if it weren't nasty, they wouldn't need a back door. If it were something useful and helpful, they'd just put it in the menu and let you do it when you want it. But because they know it's nasty, they realize you're not going to do it when they want to impose it on you, so they arrange to be able to force it on you. That's what the back door is for. It's hard to detect a back door in a non-free program. How can you tell? You can't study the code usually. So the only way to detect there is a back door is to observe it functioning. And that's what happened with the Amazon swindle when, in 2009, when Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book. From observation, we learned that there was a back door to remotely erase books. Some users witnessed this grand Orwellian act in the moment because the book disappeared as they were reading it. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. The most ironic possible choice. So there was a lot of criticism, and Amazon said it would never do this except under command from the state. Yes, if you've read 1984, you will not consider that a very comforting promise. But it wasn't even a promise. It was just some noise Amazon could make. It was not a legal commitment. And of course, Amazon doesn't care about moral commitments. So a few years later, Amazon returned to remotely erasing books without even a command from the state. We know of some other backdoors. For instance, iOS, the operating system of the iMonsters, has a command for remotely erasing, or maybe it's irrevocably deactivating any app, a backdoor for this. Android has even more. It has a backdoor for either erasing any app or forcibly installing any app. So Google has the power to do that to any Android device. This backdoor is in Google Play, which is one of the non-free components of Android. A backdoor in a driverless taxi could be extremely dangerous because somebody could tell it to ignore the destination you specified and take you to the CIA torture site or the secret police prison, and you would be unable to prevent it from doing so. So is this going to happen? Will countries do this? We can be sure China will do this. We can be sure Saudi Arabia will do this. In Saudi Arabia, each taxi might be equipped with a saw so that you wouldn't come out of the taxi in one piece. And what about the U.S.? Will the U.S. do this? I'm afraid it is likely. And what about Denmark? We don't know. But you shouldn't trust your government not to do this. You shouldn't trust a driverless taxi unless it has no way of knowing who you are. So it has to have no cameras, nothing that could enable it to identify you. If it accepts any voice commands, they have to be processed locally with no connection. But I would feel safer typing in my destination. I wouldn't want it to recognize my voice. Now, one interesting point here is the taxi doesn't belong to you. So even if the software in the taxi is free, in this case that doesn't protect you, because those copies are not yours, they belong to the taxi company. So if the program is free, the taxi company can change them. But obviously you're not allowed to install modified software in someone else's car. And that means you can't protect yourself that way. It's got to be that the car doesn't know who you are. Then there's censorship. Apple was the pioneer in implementing censorship of apps. In the iPhone, for the first time, the user couldn't freely install the apps of per choice. The user could only install apps approved by Apple from Apple's store. And Apple practiced this censorship power arbitrarily according to its commercial interests and its political positions until 2017, at which point China ordered Apple to block VPN apps. And Apple discovered it was compelled to obey, compelled to censor for China, because Apple had given itself the power to censor, and China knew this. If the iPhone had been like other computers previously, Apple would have had an answer to give. Oh, but China, you know, we always want to please you, but we can't do this. We don't control what programs the user can install. We can't stop the user from installing a VPN. Please understand, China. We'll do an extra favor for you next time. But China knew that Apple had this power and ordered Apple to use it for China, and Apple did. When the users found a way to evade Apple's censorship, they called it jailbreaking, recognizing in effect that the iPhone and the iPad were jails for their users. And that's our term for such a computer. It's a jail. Then there are universal backdoors. Well, actually, first I'll mention a couple of other malicious functionalities I don't have slides for yet. One is addictiveness. Games are often designed to be addictive. The Facebook app is designed to be addictive. Now, Facebook in general is made addictive. Partly that's due to how the server behaves, so the client program may not be responsible. But there are aspects of the addictiveness that you could reduce if you could change the client program. You could make it counteract some of the things the server does to get people addicted. But you can't do that because you can't change it because the client program is non-free. And then there is manipulation. Some devices now which answer questions for you, well, they will manipulate you into doing things, into buying from particular businesses that paid for that. Pokemon Go is an example. It would make Pokemon appear in particular stores because those stores paid for it, and thus it would lead lots of people into those stores. And there are universal backdoors. That means a backdoor with the power to remotely change the code. And if somebody can change the code in your machine, person could do any nasty thing to you through your machine. Well, Microsoft Windows has a universal backdoor, at least starting with Windows XP. It was discovered by analysis of the messages that came out of Windows XP. But Microsoft never acknowledged this. However, with Windows Vista, Microsoft proudly announced that it had a universal backdoor, calling it a different name. It calls this thing auto upgrade. we could call it auto downgrade or auto sabotage. The point is, Microsoft has the power to do any kind of harm to the user by changing the user's program. Now, there is also a universal backdoor in the Amazon swindle, and there is one in just about every portable phone. Just about every model of portable phone ever made permits remote replacement of the system software. And this is often used to convert the phone into a full-time listening device that listens all the time and transmits all the conversations it hears. And you don't have to be speaking right into the phone. It can operate in speakerphone mode at any time. So if one of you brought a portable phone here, it could be reporting my words to somebody right now. And if you think you could get your privacy back by switching it off, ha ha, there's no off switch. Only a button that says, "Oh, great Sir Telephone, would you please be so kind as to switch off for me?" But once it's been modified, it never really switches off. It pretends to switch off, while in fact it continues running, listening, and transmitting. Put this together with another surveillance functionality, namely tracking your movements, because every few minutes it sends out a signal telling the network where it is. And what you get is Stalin's dream. That's my term for such a device. What would Stalin have wanted to order every inhabitant of the Soviet Union to carry? Something that would report per movements and listen to the conversations around per. So, when I first thought about possibly getting a mobile phone, I asked around. After all, it was digital technology. It had non-free software. It was likely to be malware. So I asked and I found out these things, and I decided it was my duty as a citizen to resist. So I've never had a mobile phone, and I refuse to have one. I'll go to great lengths of practical inconvenience to do things without a mobile phone, because I feel it's my duty as a citizen to resist this kind of totalitarian surveillance. It's the basis in China for the social credit system, recognizing everything that people do and judging them by each thing that they do. And some of them end up being grabbed and disappeared. Sometimes one program has several malicious functionalities. This is the Netflix app. It spies on the user, making a dossier of each thing the user watches. It puts on digital shackles of DRM, and it makes the user agree to an anti-socializing contract, a contract saying, "I agree to be a jerk." Because what the user has to agree to is not sharing copies, not even lending the one and only copy that the user has, and not even giving the copy to someone else. So it's much more restrictive, for instance, than copyright law. Now, if you have agreed to such a contract, that's no excuse for behaving like a jerk. You still have the moral obligations to be a good member of your community by helping other people. So you just morally have to break that contract. But I don't feel good about agreeing to a contract if I know I'd be morally obliged to break it. I feel better refusing to agree to the contract, and that's what I always do. I have never knowingly agreed to a contract that had such requirements. I just say no. Get lost. There are other nasty things the developer can do of a non-free program can do to the users. This is not a functionality, so it isn't a malicious functionality. But Microsoft, when it learns of a security problem in Windows, informs the US NSA, a spy agency, before it fixes the problem, which means it's helping the US government enter the computers of Microsoft's own clients. Do you think the government of Denmark should use Microsoft Windows? Obviously not. But we don't know that other companies don't do the same thing. It's only Microsoft that we have any information about. With the others, it's absence of evidence, which is not evidence of absence. Well, these are only a few examples, but they're enough to demonstrate that nearly every user of proprietary software is the victim of proprietary malware, because almost every one of them is using at least one of the programs I have just cited. So they're using some programs we know are malware. And most of the other non-free programs they're using are probably malware also. We know of hundreds of examples. There's no time to mention them all. I just mentioned representative examples. Take a look at gnu.org/malware for our full catalog. There are many more examples that we should list, which we don't know yet. If you come across an article describing malicious functionalities of some program, and that particular malicious functionality is not in gnu.org/malware, please send mail to webmasters to inform us so we can add it. And why do they do these things? They can make more money mistreating their own users. And they don't have moral scruples about it, so they do it. Now, it's important to understand that any program can be made available as free software. And any program can be made available as non-free software. This is regardless of what the code actually says and does. And any program can be made available both as free software and as non-free software in parallel. Because the distinction between free and non-free software is purely a matter of how the program is made available for users to run. It is not directly related with what the code says and does. So these are two independent parameters of the situation. Depending on how the code is made available, it's either free or non-free. And depending on what's in the code, it's either honest or malware. So all combinations are possible. But not all combinations are frequently encountered in practice. You see, free software is almost always honest, and non-free software is usually malicious. Of course, there's a systematic reason for this. What is it? The developers, the owners of non-free software are aware that they exercise power over the program's users, and this power corrupts them, especially since their consciences were not very strong on this issue to begin with, especially since that whole field has come to accept malicious functionalities as normal. Those who might perhaps have thought of resisting this temptation, they're being encouraged by their bosses, their co-workers, everyone they know, to go ahead and do it. So that's what usually happens. They know that the users can't stop them. They know that usually the users can't even tell it's happening, although that depends on what kind of malicious functionality it is. Some are visible and some are not. What this means is that But even when the users find out about it, they can't do anything to stop it. So this means that you can't rationally trust a non-free program. The only way you can trust it is through blind faith. And often it's blind faith in a company that has already mistreated people and thus demonstrated it does not deserve that blind faith. Usually the company has already mistreated people and was caught, and instead of apologizing humbly and promising not to do it again, it tried to claim that it was doing users a favor by mistreating them. That's what innovation in the computing field means nowadays. It's thinking of new ways to mistreat the users and new smooth-sounding excuses to pretend it's okay. I hope you understand why I do not, in general, think innovation is a good thing nowadays. It's innovation in how companies can mistreat people. It's not innovation primarily in helping people. That might be a means to an evil end. So, in general, is innovation a desirable thing? If you get to choose which innovations you will use, then innovation tends to be good for you. But nowadays, companies can force things on people, and they're doing this constantly, and that means innovation is a threat. Our society talks about innovation too much. It praises innovation too much. You shouldn't, I think that we should all place our freedom in our community above innovation. So this is why you can't trust a non-free program and why they generally tend to be not deserving of our trust. But with free software, you can rationally trust it because you know that we, the contributors, do not have power over you. You know that the user community of the program has the ultimate control over what it will do and what it won't do, and that some users are programmers, and if they find anything nasty, they'll take it out. And that thus the user community can protect itself because those users who are programmers will protect the other users. They'll make fixed versions of the program that are better, that are ethical, not merely better. This is the only known defense against malicious functionalities in a program, for the user community of that program to have control over it. In other words, for it to be free software. It's not a perfect defense. It's not guaranteed, but it's a lot better than being defenseless as the user of a non-free program. So I urge you to recognize in any non-free program a trap to mistreat you, something that you would be wise to reject. Come live with us in the free world that we have built. We built it with the GNU operating system and the Linux kernel. I started developing the GNU system in 1983. Well, I announced it in 83 and started in January 84. I developed GNU for the specific purpose of making it possible to use computers in freedom. The computer needs an operating system. In 83, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. It was impossible to buy a computer and use it in freedom. But I could change that because I was an operating system developer. I decided I would make computing free. That's why it was worth the trouble to develop another operating system. Most operating systems are developed by people with values very different from mine. They're developed either for commercial motives or technical motives. I wouldn't have bothered to make another operating system for those purposes, but I was working for something more important than profit or technical advance. I was working for freedom for everyone. I started writing parts of GNU in 1984. Of course, I recruited others to write other parts. By 91, we had almost a complete usable system, but one major essential component was missing. That was the kernel, which is the component that allocates the computer's resources to the other programs that you run. In 1991, Mr. Torvalds released his kernel, Linux. In 91, Linux was not free software, so we couldn't use it. But in 92, he re-released Linux under a free license. Maybe someone else can help you? And that made it possible for us to fit Linux into the last remaining gap in the GNU system, producing the combination gnu/linux. For the first time, there was a free operating system, gnu/linux, that you could run on a PC. In other words, filling the last gap achieved the goal that was the purpose of developing GNU. Well, that was a big milestone, but at the same time, a confusion got started. People started referring to this entire system as Linux, ignoring GNU, effectively denying the existence of GNU, and attributing our work to someone else, someone who started later and didn't do quite as much. And I think that that is unfair. It's not nice. Please give us equal mention. That's the right thing to do, and it's easy. You just say gnu/linux. Some people say 4 syllables, that's too much, but they do sometimes say Microsoft Windows, which is 5 syllables. Somehow, that's not objectionable. So if you're in the habit of causing this confusion, if you're in the habit of talking about Linux distros or running Linux, well, those terms are inaccurate. To be accurate, please call them gnu/linux distros. I'm running gnu/linux. Please give us equal mention. So, in principle, gnu/linux is a free operating system, but in practice, it's usually not. You see, there are thousands of different variants of gnu/linux, versions of the system. They're called distros or distributions. Each one has its own development team. Just a second. Will this water still be hot? I don't know whose this is. No, but who does it belong to, this pot?
The cantina here.
Do you know if the water will still be hot, or should you get more hot water?
It was made just before you arrived.
I know.
So
Will it remain hot for an hour?
they've gone home now, so there's no choice.
Oh, there's no way to get more. Oh, no. So anyway, each distro's development team decides what programs to put into it. If it puts in a non-free program, then that distro is not a free distro. It contains non-free software. So it doesn't entirely respect your freedom. This is a big problem in the free software community. In fact, there are thousands of distros that are not entirely free, and there are 10 or so that are free. So look at gnu.org/distros to get advice on which distros are free. That way you can avoid the pitfall of coming most of the way to freedom and then getting stuck and not getting all the way. Now, running a non-free distro such as Ubuntu is better than running Windows or macOS, better than running Android, but it doesn't get you all the way to freedom. And those distros generally discourage valuing freedom. So the developers of Ubuntu could say, you deserve freedom in your computing, but you won't get it from us. That would be honest and frank. But they don't like to say that. So instead they say, we try to offer you the best possible user experience. What they're saying is, value convenience and don't think about freedom. How do you teach values to other people? You do it by basing your own words and your deeds on those values. The words and the deeds of Ubuntu are based on valuing practical convenience only, and that's what it teaches users to value. But keeping our freedom and winning the rest of it depends on teaching people to value freedom. So the activities of Ubuntu work directly against that vital goal. Please raise your hands if you are or want to be a software developer. Please raise your hand if not. Mostly software developers. I keep hoping we will reach more effectively to non-programmers, to people in other areas of life, because this issue needs to spread out beyond the software field to other people whose lives are impacted by these issues of freedom. In any case, if you're a software developer, you need to know about free licenses. You see, today's copyright law is very bad. Due to the Berne Convention, everything that's written, including every program, is automatically copyrighted. And by default, copyright law forbids copying, modifying, or distributing the work. So how can a program be free software? That's done through an explicit declaration on the part of the copyright holders that gives every user the 4 freedoms. And that declaration we call a free software license. So the license is not a mere summary or comment. Putting on the license is what gives the users freedom. The license is the most crucial part of the code, since without that, the code would be non-free and thus make the world a worse place. So don't be careless about licenses. Pay attention. The right way to state the license of the code is to put a notice on each source file. This is to make it clear to everybody that gets that source file what its license is, meaning what the users are allowed to do with that source file, because they need to know that. You don't want them to break the license by accident. That's making a trap for them to fall into. So go make your best effort to inform people how they're allowed to use that file by putting a license notice on it. And if you're using the GNU General Public License, well, the GNU GPL has multiple versions. Right now we're using version 3. Someday perhaps there will be a version 4, unless we're lucky. So, how do you upgrade the license version? there are two ways of doing this. Creative Commons licenses just say, if you're in version 3, it says the user can use a later version, so now they could use the same work under version 4 of their Creative Commons licenses. And if there's ever a version 5, everybody will be allowed automatically to use version 5. With the GNU GPL, because it was the first time anybody did this kind of version upgrading thing, I felt I had to give the developers a choice. So I said that in the license notice you can say what to do about future versions. So you can either say this code can be used under the GNU General Public License version 3, or you can say you can redistribute this under the GNU General Public License version 3 or any later version published by the Free Software Foundation. If you say that, you get the same situation as with Creative Commons licenses. Please do that, because the license upgrading is very important. If something is stuck now under GPL version 2, you can't link it with programs that are under GPL version 3 because they're different. This is the reason why we set up this method for license version upgrades. Now, there are various free licenses. Every one of them grants the 4 freedoms, but they do it differently. Many licenses are weak licenses. That means they don't know how to say no. These licenses say, use this code any way you like, just keep my name on it. Well, that makes it free software, we can use it, but it fails to defend our freedom. And so IBM took the code of Apache and put it into a non-free modified version, and IBM could do this because the Apache license is a weak license. So now there's an IBM modified version of Apache. The users of that get the code of Apache, but they don't get the freedom of Apache. That's unfortunate. My goal in developing GNU was to give users freedom. I realized, seeing examples of this problem back then, that the same thing could happen to GNU programs, and then GNU would be a failure at its main goal, which is to give users freedom, unless I found a way to stop it. So I developed a way to stop it, and that's called copyleft. The idea of copyleft is to put some requirements on how you distribute under freedoms 2 and 3. Of course, you're free to redistribute, but you have to do it in the ethical way, which means under the same license and providing the complete corresponding source code. And this makes sure, this requirement on intermediaries ensures that the users who get copies from them get freedom as well. This is why every copy of every version of a GNU package is required to come with freedom. So I implemented copyleft in the GNU General Public License. It's a copyleft license because it puts these requirements on. And the result of releasing code that way is that companies such as IBM help develop the free version. In fact, they work closely with the development team to help their changes get in and released. So one other nice effect of using copyleft is that you get companies cooperating with each other, not out of the good of their hearts, because they don't have hearts, but nonetheless, we arrange the situation such that it's in their interest to do what is good for society. Well, if you've installed only free software in your computer, then you still might be running non-free programs because they come in web pages nowadays. And some of those programs in web pages are free and some are not. But we didn't want to run these non-free programs that come in the web page. So we developed a browser add-on called Libre.js that analyzes these programs, checking each program for whether it's trivial or free. For free, it's basically, does it carry a license and a source code pointer? And if the program is either trivial or free, then Libre.js permits it to run. It's called Libre.js because these programs are typically written in JavaScript.js. But that's actually just a technical detail. The point is, these are the programs that come in web pages, and you've got to watch out for them. So Libre.js protects you from the execution of non-free JavaScript code. It also indicates on the screen whether the page contains any non-free, any blocked JavaScript code that was non-free and non-trivial. And it also searches heuristically through the site for where and how to complain to the webmasters, making it quick and easy to complain. So please complain. It's important for the webmasters to get lots of complaints. We want them to change. A lot of them chose to they developed their sites or had someone develop their sites in a way that tramples users' freedom, not even for any concrete reason. They just paid no attention to the issue. They didn't know there was an issue. They went to somebody who said, see how nice our sites look? We'll do this for you. Somebody who never cared about this question. And now they got a site that in the free world we can't see. We have to educate them. Nowadays, there's another way you can lose control of your computing activities. It's called SaaS, Service as a Software Substitute. Meaning, somebody says, don't do that activity running on your own computer. Send me all your data and let me do this computing for you. And if you accept that offer, you lose control of how that computing is done. It's the equivalent of running a non-free program to do it, because you don't control what's happening in your own computing. If you run a non-free program, you don't control what it does because you don't control what's in that program. If you use service as a software substitute, you don't control how it's done because it's done in somebody else's computer. And even if that computer is running free software, it's per copies, not your copies. So person controls them, not you. The only way you can control how your computing activity gets done is if you run it with free software on your own computer, with your own copy of free software, which is under your control, which you're free to change, free to join with other users so they can improve it for you. So I never accept these offers to do my computing on somebody else's server. However, when it's a matter of communicating with other people, the use of servers and network nodes and basically computers belonging to others, belonging to neither of you two, is inescapable. So, okay, there's no use fighting it there. But we don't have to accept it when it concerns our own computing. There we can reject it, so we should reject it. And how do you tell if an activity is your own computing? With a thought experiment. Imagine you've got a very powerful computer with whatever free software you might want and no network connection. Is it possible to do this job there? And assume you have whatever data might be desired. If it's possible to do the job in that situation, that proves it's your own computing activity, and you deserve total control over it. But there are activities which would be obviously impossible to do that way, and that's because they involve other people as well as you. They're not your own computing. So surveillance is a big danger nowadays. Lots of different companies collect data, and government-controlled systems collect personal data, and they all add up to a gigantic collection of data, and to a large extent, the databases are virtually combined, even if they're not physically combined, because they can be used in combination. Now, they're collected by many different systems. I should have put on this something for cameras that recognize people, and phone companies that keep track of what sites you contact and where you are, and other things like that. So you can imagine that they're in there too. Well, this is broken up into various separate databases, but these databases get made available to data brokers, and the data brokers may get the data without names and addresses and so on, but then they figure out which ones are the same people. They can do this by correlating the data themselves. So they convert it into one giant database they can use any way they like. And in general, they're not regulated at all because they have no agreement with any of the users, any of the persons that the data is about. And typically the state can take all of that data. In the US, it's the FBI, which can take any database of personal data just by saying so without even a court order, and it's done secretly. And the FBI can combine all these databases and make the result available to any other government agency. So it adds up to total government surveillance, the sort of thing that leads directly to China. If you want to be living in China, no matter which country it actually is, this is the way. So there's a proposal to try to hamper surveillance capitalism by breaking up the bigger companies into separate companies that would be collecting parts of the data. So here's what that would look like. Well, it might do it might hamper surveillance capitalism some, it might do some good, but the data will still get to the data brokers that will combine it virtually by identifying people in different records, and the FBI will still be able to get it all. By the way, I've been told that Denmark recently adopted a government surveillance law that allows the government to take all these databases too. An interesting question is, which country do you want your data to be kept in? And that can be reformulated as, which country do you want to have an easy chance of spying on you? Well, that depends partly on how you live your life, but in general, you'd like your personal data to be kept only in a country that you have nothing to do with. So if you live in Russia, you're probably safest if your data is in the US. If you live in China, you want your data to be in the US. If you live in the US, you probably want your data to be stored in China. If you live in the US and you don't go to China, then basically you don't have Chinese relatives and so on, then China's not going to bother you. And likewise, if you live in China and your data is in the US is not going to bother you. It can't. It's not in a position to. But if you live in the US, you don't want your data to be available to the US government because it could hurt you. If you live in Denmark, well, I might suggest, say, Russia. Denmark and Russia are probably not going to be very friendly, so it's a safe place for data about you to be. So we want freedom. What are the obstacles? One of the obstacles is the term open source. You may have noticed that I haven't said the word open even once, or the word closed. And the reason is, the term open source was invented in 1998 as a way of talking about the same free programs, but forgetting and burying our moral ideas about freedom. There were people in the free software community who didn't want to talk about freedom, mostly because they rejected the idea that this was a matter of freedom, a matter of right and wrong. So they coined this term open source, which didn't allude in any way to freedom. And then they developed a new discourse based purely on practical convenience values that never raised the issue in terms of right or wrong. They presented it only in terms of practical convenience. So we say, if you develop and release a program, it's your moral duty to respect users' freedom to change and redistribute it. They go to great lengths never to say anything like that. Instead, they say, if you develop and release a program, please consider whether it might be in your practical advantage to let the users change and redistribute it, because then they might give you practical benefits like improving the code quality. Above all, they want to avoid the idea that users are entitled to freedoms that software developers are morally bound to respect. That's the big disagreement between open source and free software. And to make this clear, I never advocate open source. I don't want to give people the wrong idea of where I stand. I don't want people to hear me and then go away thinking I'm in favor of improving code quality. Well, all else being equal, I do like improving code quality for programs that are free. For programs that are non-free, I'd rather the code quality got worse and they went out of business. But it's a terrible weakness of society to treat code quality as the most important value. So, at the practical level, as a matter of which programs you're talking about, if you say open source, you're talking about almost the same set of programs as free software. There are small differences. I know of some programs that are open source but not free. Sometimes because they have weird licenses with restrictions that we consider too restrictive. For instance, there is Open Whatcom. It's a program that has a license that's open source but not free. And then there are some Microsoft software where the source code is released under a free license, but Microsoft distributes executables in a non-free way. So you could get the source code and build it yourself, and then it's free software. But those executables are not free software. And then there are also weird cases involving the executables of Linux running in certain computers that require the manufacturer's signature on the code. Because you could get the source code of that version of Linux and change it and compile it, but you won't get that machine to run your modified version. So our interpretation of this is that the executable is non-free, even though the source code is free. And this really happens, and it really imposes restrictions on what users can do. It's a real injustice, not merely a hypothetical, conceptual one. It's a real injustice that does real harm. But the big difference between open source and free software is at the level of philosophy. not so much which programs we're talking about, but what we are saying about those programs. If you say they're free software, you say one thing, and if you say they're open source, you say another thing. So it makes a difference which one you say. Now, in 1998, the majority of the community was in favor of the open source viewpoint. And the major media went along with this, and since then it's rare to see the term free software in important media. In fact, most of the people who've heard about me have heard me erroneously associated with the term open source. People write to me thanking me for what I've done for open source. I can't let that misunderstanding continue. I have to explain. I'm afraid that you've been misinformed. I don't agree with open source. That's the slogan for rejecting what I stand for. And I point them at a page that explains. I've even seen articles that call me the father of open source. Leaving so soon? Well, at least please take stickers on your way out. I say, if I'm the father of open source, it was, in my letter to the editor, I say this, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived via artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I present the name of the free software movement and what it stands for. And this is a serious part of the letter, but it's fun to start with a joke. Well, I do all I can to spread awareness of the free software movement. Oh, I've also seen articles saying that free software was a precursor to open source. No, sir, we're still here. We haven't disappeared. So we need your help in showing people that free software is still here. And one way to do that is when you describe what I do, call it free software or free Libre software, not open anything. And if you agree with us, please show this very visibly. So supposing you agree with the free software movement, why in the world should you give the impression you support open source instead? That's a different, weaker philosophy. Why not show where you really stand and help us? We need this help tremendously. Now, I never use the term FOSS. And the reason is it stands for Free and Open Source Software. Well, the problem is that makes open source very visible, and it doesn't show free software very visible because that's split apart. And people might think that free there means gratis, which it doesn't. So using the term FOSS still tends to put free software at a disadvantage, at a handicap. So please don't use that term, even if other people around you do. Occasionally we use the term FLOSS, which stands for free/Libre and open source software. And this way, free/Libre and open source have equal visibility, and it's clear that by free we are talking about freedom. So that term really is at least neutral between these two camps. So if you want to be neutral, that's the way to really be neutral. But I don't want to be neutral. I want to win support for free software as much as I can. So I don't say FLOSS. And if you support us, please don't say FLOSS either. Well, occasionally I do. If I'm trying to plan some sort of joint campaign and I want to get open source supporters to participate too, then I'll propose using the term FLOSS. Since it's neutral, they're not suffering a disadvantage. They have no reason to refuse. Okay, that's a sensible thing to do in some cases where neutrality is needed. But most of the time, don't be neutral. Stand for our cause. Now, another obstacle is when the specs... Yeah? Is that an alarm or a bird? What?
A parrot?
No, it didn't sound like a parrot to me. It was apparently not. So, when the specs of the hardware are secret, how can we write free software to control that hardware? We can't use the non-free programs that the manufacturers distribute because we'd be running non-free software and taking away our freedom. So what we need is reverse engineering. We need somebody very clever to figure out the language of communication, the interface between the non-free driver and the hardware. And then passing that to a programmer, it will make possible the development of the free replacement for that non-free program. If you want to make a very important technical contribution to the free software community, to the free world, do reverse engineering. There are not enough people who do it, and it's important. It's also a lucrative professional career. So that makes two reasons why this university should be teaching it. There should be classes, workshops in reverse engineering, because it's a good profession to get into and because it's necessary to advance in certain theaters of our fight. And speaking of schools, all schools should teach exclusively free software. By school, I include all the levels of schools from kindergarten to university and adult education. And when I say teach, that's not limited to formal instruction in using a particular program. Anything the school does with its students that leads them to use a particular program should lead them only to free software. But this should, and the reason for this is that the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. In computing, that means graduating users accustomed to free software and ready to live as members of such a society. But this should not be a mysterious policy that has to be obeyed because somebody said so. Just the opposite. Classes should teach the civic values behind free software, show the students why it's vital that they use free software and reject the non-free. And the school must never teach non-free software because that's implanting dependence in the future of society. Teaching the use of a non-free program is as bad as teaching the use of tobacco. Must never be done in a school. But then there's moral education and citizenship, teaching people the habit of helping other people, teaching the opposite of what that nasty Netflix contract teaches people. So every class should have the following rule. Students, if you bring a program to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including source code, in case someone else here wants to learn. Because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, you're not allowed to bring non-free programs to class except to do reverse engineering on them. But the school, to set a good example, must follow its own rule. It must bring only free programs to class and then offer copies to everyone with source code to everyone in the class that wants them. But there's also the education of the best programmers. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's a free program, it offers that knowledge to the students. It supports education. But if it's a non-free program, it conceals that knowledge from the students, which means it's the enemy of the spirit of education. And schools must show their loyalty to the spirit of education. They must not tolerate these programs in the school except for reverse engineering, which is the way you get out the secret knowledge. And how do you learn to write good, clear code? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. But only free software offers the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. Then you have to write lots of code, but as a beginner, you're not yet ready to write large programs and do it the right way. You haven't learned how. So how do you learn? You do it by writing small changes in existing large programs, and then you advance to bigger changes. And then you get them criticized so you can get feedback and advance. But only free software offers the chance to write changes in existing large programs that we really use. And then have people use your modified versions and report the bugs to you. Thus, every school can offer the chance to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. If you have a relationship with a school, if you're a student or a teacher or an administrator or an employee or the parent of a student, it's your responsibility to campaign for the school to migrate to free software, to stop teaching with non-free software. And that's going to require teaching other people in the school's community about this issue so that you can build your movement. So you're going to have to give talks and hand out information about this issue. And eventually, over time, you can persuade the school to start treating students justly. And do keep in mind that non-free software typically spies on users, and non-free educational software, of course, spies on users. So the school is also violating the students' privacy by teaching the students to run non-free software. And in the US, this is actually illegal, but the schools twist the law by saying that the company that's collecting the data that owns the non-free software is an officer of the school, which means it's allowed to receive this data. That's bullshit, of course. If you're running a local school, Google is not an officer of your school. Neither is Apple, nor Microsoft, nor Amazon, nor any other such company. Human rights depend on each other, which means that if we lose one human right, it becomes harder to defend the other human rights. Now that we use computing for so many important social activities, control of our computing, which starts with free software, has become one of the human rights we must defend in order to be able to defend the rest. And this often requires a sacrifice. If you want freedom, you must learn to make sacrifices to keep your freedom. If you think about this question in a short-term way each time, if you just ask, is this program convenient for me right now? That means you're treating freedom as valueless, and you're systematically going to decide to throw it away. And the world that you see around you in computing is the natural result of making decisions in this bad way. So you've got to get ready to decide differently, to start saying no more and more. A large part of the way you defend freedom is just by saying, no, I won't. I was really happy to hear that in Denmark there's actually a campaign of students against being required to run Windows and other non-free software to take exams. I wouldn't put Windows into my computer, no way. What I'd say to the school is, I'll take my exam on the school's kiosk if you want. Let's work at a time that the kiosk is available, and I'll do it. I won't have this in my computer. But since it's the school's software that you want me to run, and since I'd be doing it to talk to the school, I'll do it with the school's computer. That gives the school an alternative that it can feasibly accept. And then you have to pressure the school enough that it does accept it. You're going to have to say no. And I hope that some of the faculty will help you say no. So how do you help our cause? If you have a talent for software, you can help by contributing to free software projects. I suggest you contribute to 15 projects run by others before you try starting your own project. That way you'll have learned how to do a good job. But most people don't have a talent for writing software. Most people are, if they can do it at all, they're not really good at it. And it's not, therefore, the useful use of your time. So do something else. For instance, help organize activism. Now, people are organizing now to campaign for free software, and I hope soon I will, if you, have we distributed the pieces of paper yet? Oh, then do it please now. I should have said this long ago. We have pieces of paper you can write your name on and your email address. If you want to be on the Free Software Foundation's announcement list, if you could pass around a piece of paper in each row, then people could do this reasonably quickly. Emil, are you giving them out just at the top? Well, no, that's too long. There isn't time. There are many pieces of paper there, and the idea is to give out one on each row. Could you please do that? I can't hear you at all. Well, please. People have pens. Their neighbors have pens. I'm afraid that won't be finished. But it won't get around by the time I'm finished, because I'm almost finished. I should have started it sooner. This is a big mistake on my part, but now, please, how many pieces of paper did you hand out? Emil, how many pieces of paper did you give at the top of each one? But please start some more in the middle and at the front. Would you please do that? People who don't have pens, we'll give them a chance afterward. Anyway, once the campaign is organized, we'll send you each a message saying telling you how to get in touch with it if you want to participate. Now, for activism, we need speakers. If you want to learn to be a free software speaker, that will be a big contribution. We also need organizers of the group. The person who keeps the membership lists, invites speakers, sets up meetings, collects the annual dues, or whatever. And these call for totally different personality traits. So if you can't do one, maybe you can do the other. You can help persuade schools and governments. I already explained about schools, but you can see lots of examples as well in gnu.org/education. The government should do all its computing with free software because its mission is to do the people's computing. And to do it right, it has to maintain control of how that computing is done. It mustn't let companies control how the people's computing is done. So the government has to do that computing with free software, with the government's own copies of free software on government computers. If you're an expert in using the system, help other users. Start a gnu/linux user group and invite people to come there and get help. If there's an existing gnu/linux user group, go there and help people. If there's an existing gnu/linux user group that erroneously calls itself a Linux user group, then you can go there, but from time to time, remind people that the organization ought to change its name. Because they're not using Linux by itself, they're using the GNU plus Linux combination. And just by saying free software whenever it's pertinent, rather than open source, you will be helping to spread awareness of the free software movement. People might ask you, why do you say free software instead of open source? And then you can explain why. You can teach people what the difference is and why it's important. There are lots of other kinds of work we need. There's no room here for all of them. But look at gnu.org/help. It lists many other kinds of work we need, and pick how you'd like to help. Also, in gnu.org/philosophy, there are many articles about various specific points about the free software movement and free software. In /licenses, you'll find everything about licenses, which ones are free, which are not, how the free licenses are different, which free licenses are good to use and when, how to choose a license for your work. In gnu.org/government, you will find the policies we recommend for a government to adopt so as to migrate all its public agencies to free software over time. And it's going to take a lot of time. Something like that can't be done in a week or even in a year. But if you push steadily, maybe it can be done in a decade. In gnu.org/GNU, you'll find the history of the GNU system, of its development. In /malware, you'll find lists of hundreds of different malicious functionalities, each one documented by a reference to the press. In /distros, you'll find everything about the which distros are free, and for the distros that are not free, for the well-known ones, we'll explain in what way they're not free. We also have the site of the Free Software Foundation, which is fsf.org. As you leave, you can buy things. If you're going to leave, you don't have to miss out. And you can also take stickers outside.
I will. Thank you for the talk. We should also allow people to ask a single question.
Please, I know what I'm doing. Please. Are we going to be forced to leave here at some point soon?
I think in the spirit of freedom, we should allow people to also...
People are leaving. Obviously, everyone's free to leave. I don't even have a gun here, so I can't stop you.
That's good. So, of course, we can continue a little bit, but...
Yeah, but please stop. No, we will. But first I'm going to finish. The funniest part is coming very soon. Please leave it in my hands. I'm doing the best I can. So, in fsf.org, and you can remember FSF because it's Free Software Foundation, you can see resources for using and developing free software. You can see political actions you can support. You can also buy things, you can make donations, you can put yourself on our announcement mailing list. I hope these papers are circulating around. And you can become a member of the FSF. But if you want to become a member and pay your dues in cash, you can do that here because I'm here to accept the dues. So, now it's time to present my other identity. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Although I see one that maybe requires an exorcism. I can't be sure. It has a lit up logo. Emacs was initially a program, an extensible text editor that I had written that developed over the years into a way of life for many users because they extended it so much they could do all their editing without ever leaving Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which used to be amusing to visit, but I'm afraid it's not used anymore. Unless you could bring it back. In the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several versions of Emacs, and we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the confession of the faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a real expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fu Bar Mitzvah, in which you chant a portion of our sacred scriptures. That is to say, the system source code. And there's a lot of room for contribution in developing customary melodies to use for this. In the Church of Emacs, we have abolished the priesthood of technology because anyone is welcome to read our sacred scriptures. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which means anyone who has never used or known Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a breakaway Tibetan sect that claims it is sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script. But the Mother Church holds that to gain spiritual merit, you must type them by hand. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever diabolical proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control, and then install in their place a wholly free operating system, where holy can be spelled in more than one way, and then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, you too will be a saint, and you'll have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. There is a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other editor, VI. So people occasionally ask whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. 5 years ago, I went to China, and some VI users said on social media that they should attack me. I was shocked, but apparently violence begins with VI. People occasionally ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you. Now for the auction. Now comes the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy the GNU, I can autograph this card. If you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. Every penguin needs a GNU. We can accept payment in cash with a bank card if it can make international payments by phone. We could accept it with Bitcoin if you have something here to make the payment through, and we can accept it through mobile pay, thanks to that account. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount you're bidding so I can hear you. I have hearing problems. If you speak quietly from the back, I may not even realize you're talking at all. So wave your arm and immediately shout the amount. Don't wait till I look at you before you shout. Just the opposite. Shout, and then maybe I'll see where you are.
100.
No, sorry. I'm not ready. And the other thing is, I'm going to start with the regular price, which is $25, or basically 200 kroner. So do I get 200 kroner for this adorable GNU?
200.
I've got 200. Do I get 250?
300.
Okay, yeah, I've got 300. Do I get 350? I've got 350. Do I get 400?
400.
Who said 400 first?
500.
Is that you?
Yeah.
I've got 500. Do I get 550? I've got 500.
550.
Who say? I've got 550. Do I get 600 for this adorable GNU? Do I get 600 for this adorable GNU?
600.
I've got 600. Do I get 650? How much?
650.
I've got 650. Do I get 700 for this adorable GNU?
700.
I've got 700. Do I get 750? Do I get 750 for this adorable GNU? Do I get 750 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom? I've got 750. Do I get 800 for this adorable GNU?
800.
I've got 800. Do I get 850? 850 to the Free Software Foundation for this adorable GNU. Do I get 850?
850.
I've got 850. Do I get 900? Do I get?
900.
I've got 900. Do I get 950 for this adorable GNU? 950 to the Free Software Foundation for this adorable GNU. How much?
950.
I've got 950. Do I get 1,000?
1,000.
I've got 1,000. Do I get 1,100?
1,050.
No, I want to advance
1,100.
because I like to advance by at least 10%. Otherwise, it would take a long time to get to the ultimate amount. I've got 1,100. Do I get 1,200? I've got 1,100. Do I get 1,200 for this adorable GNU? 1,200 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 1,200 or more. Last chance. Going.
1,200.
I've got 1,200. Do I get 1,300?
1300.
I've got 1,300. Do I get 1,400? Want to make him pay more? Do I get 1,400? What? I've got 1,400. Do I get 1,500?
1500.
I've got 1,500. Do I get 1,600? I've got 1,500. Do I get 1,600 for this adorable GNU? 1,600 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Do I get 1,600? Last chance to bid 1,600 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 1,500. Please come up and pay. So how do you wish to pay? Okay, please do it, and she'll confirm that you've done it, and then you'll get the GNU. I'll sign it if you wish after the questions. So now it's time for questions. Is there another microphone? I've got
I
one.
was starting this one up. So.
What I suggest is that you stand in one place, like over there, and people make a queue. Come over here and make a queue to ask questions.
Yes.
This is the most efficient method, and it's also fair, because if you get into the queue, you'll get your turn. It doesn't depend on whether you get recognized.
And I think we have to limit it to, say, 20 minutes because...
Okay.
Yeah.
It's too bad, but
Yeah.
I don't know why it's taking so long these days. Usually it doesn't take so long.
Does it work?
Has he paid?
Yeah.
Okay,
I
good.
know him.
So, here's your GNU, and I'll sign it later. First question.
Hello. So, hi.
Speak louder so I can hear you clearly.
I
I have
was-
hearing problems.
I was just wondering what your position is on Bitcoin. As
Well, it's free software, so I don't object to it on moral grounds, but it's not really anonymous. You know, every transaction is logged, and they can probably figure out who owns the wallet, even though you're not required to say, but by looking at what you do, they can figure it out. A real anonymous payment system doesn't allow anyone to figure out that the person who bought this today is the same person who bought that yesterday. We have one. It's called GNU Taler. Look at taler.net.
thank you.
To all of you leaving now, there are some refreshments if you go in the direction of the cantina, so just stay a little longer.
Hi, I have a question. Why hasn't the gnu+linux become as big as Microsoft Windows in
Well,
regards to operating systems?
Partly because Microsoft has a lot of money and we don't. Partly because Microsoft can pressure people into using its software and we can't. You know, because the users have the ultimate control, we can't pressure users, and that's a good thing. And partly because users have been convinced, and partly by Microsoft, to value their immediate convenience more and their freedom less. 15 years ago or so, Microsoft had an advertising campaign, Windows, where do you want to go today? And I responded to that with, how do you want to live in 5 or 10 years? So you see, Microsoft is encouraging short-term thinking.
Quick question, just you've been very anti-state today, and I know you come from a different context than Denmark, but is it really the state we should be worried about, or is it capitalism?
It's both. You know, the non-free software usually comes from companies, but the state participates in pressuring people to use it. When government services are available only if you run a so-called smartphone, a spy phone filled with non-free software, either Android or iOS, then the state is making people run non-free software, and that is a direct injustice to every citizen. Basically, in the surveillance, they're working together. We need to activate democracy and demand that the state protect us from surveillance.
You mentioned a Danish campaign for students against using closed source, non-free software.
No, I believe it's specifically against being forced by the school to do so.
Yeah, so I would really like to know about this campaign because I want to join it.
Send me mail and I'll mail you back info about it. I haven't actually talked with the people, I just saw a website.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The free software project is of course a very long-running project. How do you see the trajectory?
It's not a project, it's a movement.
Do you see the trajectories of something hopeful and progressing?
I'm a pessimist by nature. I expect defeat at every stage once there's opposition from powerful people. But it doesn't matter, because I don't base my decision on whether to keep fighting or give up on whether I expect to win, because defeat is horrible, and to give up would only guarantee defeat. So there's obviously no benefit in that. If you want to live in freedom, you simply must not give up.
I hope to make my living being a freelance software developer. How would you suggest I go about doing that, writing free software? And do you think it's
morally speaking, you shouldn't ever develop a non-free program. The most important point in that area is, does the desire to make money and the desire to do it in the software field excuse writing a non-free program? And for me, the answer is no, it does not. But if you, in regard to how you could make money by doing free software, there are a lot of people who do it, and I believe the majority of the paid software development in the world is development of custom solutions for each for a client. And that client is always going to have to pay for the work, whether the software is free or not. So if you just say, I'm going to deliver this as free software, and by the way, if you're wise, you will insist on this from anybody, but I'll do it for you anyway because I think it's right. So you can do the jobs as free software.
Yep, thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned that one of the 4 freedoms is the freedom to redistribute a piece of software.
Well, there are 2 of them. See, yeah. Freedom 2 is to redistribute without changes, and freedom 3 is to redistribute with changes.
But how would you convince a business to allow their customers to redistribute the software?
Well, first, a lot of businesses do it, so it's not that hard. But I am always going to present the issue of justice and freedom first. Because when you say, oh, this is the right thing to do, but of course, since you're a business, you don't care about what's right or wrong, so I'm going to try to persuade you with practical advantage of some kind. What you're effectively saying is, yeah, I'll join your values. And I don't want it to appear that I agree with those amoral values. I want it to be clear at every moment that the main reason to make software free is because non-free software is an injustice. So I would want to convince the companies by organizing enough people to say, we won't take your non-free software, so there. But I mean, I'm not against using other arguments, and the arguments of the open source supporters do achieve something when they convince a business. The place where I criticize is when they omit the deeper and more important arguments, and where they effectively endorse the idea that it's just a question of practical advantage.
Thank you.
So that requires care and attention. If you want to present also arguments of practical advantage while making it clear that you consider freedom and justice more important than that, you have to be careful in how you express it and be alert to pitfalls that might make it appear you are endorsing the idea of deciding by advantage alone.
Hi. So the current phones are using either iOS or Android. Do you see any light future ahead for that field in terms of...
For which field?
Phones in general.
Oh,
so that you can actually have a
there's a free version of Android called Replicant, which will run on some models. And there's a phone being developed to run free software. And it also enables you to block some of the nasty spying.
Thank you.
Right. And my question is not about software, but music, movies. You talk about DRM. And I think it's my right to make a copy of a song or an album I purchased for my car or whatever. But if we do away with all the DRM and similar schemes, how would the musicians get paid?
Well, they don't get paid now, except a few of them. The existing system pretends it is doing a good job of supporting the arts. What it's really doing is a fairly good job of supporting some of the most famous artists, the ones you'd probably have heard of, but not the new ones. The ones who have just got famous in the last few years, they probably have contracts such that most of the money that you pay goes to the record company, or the music factory, I like to call it. The musicians get nothing from what you are paying until they reach a certain number of sales or a certain number of streamings, and mostly they never get to that point. So the system is basically supporting these parasitical companies, and they pretend to be supporting the artists, and then they use, and a few of the artists that are super rich, the companies really are supporting. So those artists will come out and say, how dare you share my work without paying me? And when I see that, I think, what a jerk that musician is. Just because you're a musician doesn't mean I should respect you if you're a jerk. I believe people have a fundamental right to share copies of any published work. That includes music, visual art, literature, whatever. Now, this doesn't apply to private personal information. That's a different issue. But if it's published, it's not a secret. It's not private. And so sharing is good. Sharing should be legal. All the things that they do to stop people from sharing should be blocked one way or another.
Is your current setup running 100% free software? I'm thinking that all the way through the BIOS?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, the reason I run this computer is because you can do that.
So I see no more questions, and we have some refreshments outside. But before going outside, I have promised Kjeld Simonsen a few words, a couple of minutes.
Only a few words. My name is Kjeld Simonsen, and I'm the chairman of gnu+, which is a association much devoted to the issues that Professor Stallman is talking about. We talk about gnu+linux and free software, and that's our main purpose. But we also talk about open standards. So we are participating in open standards. The POSIX standard, POSIX was actually a coined by Richard as a name, and also C and C++ standardization, and a lot about internationalization. We have done a lot of work to make Danish work. We also translate a lot of free software into Danish, and only free software. So that's interesting. Then we also do political things like promoting free software in Denmark and to the Parliament of Folketinget and to the EU. So that's some of the things that we do. And we also hold a lot of, maybe not a lot of meetings, but we have had Richard Stallman coming a number of times. The first time Richard was here was in '85 for a conference that I arranged. And then you have been visiting us 2 or 3 times, and we are Clueless now also a host for this meeting, one of the hosts. So if you're interested in joining that work and also get announcements of next time we have Richard around, then you are free to contact us on our website, klid.dk.
Could you say that website again? I couldn't hear it.
klid.dk.
Say it's what? I couldn't hear you.
klid.dk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that.
And what does CLID stand for?
Well, it more or less doesn't stand for something, because we had to change our name, because it was first it was meant to be commercial, but then we was not allowed to do that if we had the resources that we had at the university, at the TCU, which you are visiting tomorrow. So it became professional, and then we say Linux, and then we say interesting people, what you call participant in Denmark. I know you talk about gnu+linux, and I'm happy to bring that name off and try to see if we can make a change to gnu+linux if that's, I understand that is something that you want to have.
Yes, it's important to the GNU project that you start talking about GNU/Linux, saying GNU/Linux when you're talking about this offshoot of our work. We need our name mentioned. Burying our work behind the name Linux doesn't help us recruit. And just as you need to recruit supporters, so do we. We still are doing work on improving the GNU system. There's actually an advanced, superior GNU/Linux distro called Geeks, which is GUIX, what you might find extremely interesting. Well, how are we going to recruit people to working on GNU if people don't hear that the programs are GNU? So that's important for us.
So
he was asking for the microphone back.
We already do a lot of work for the GNU project, including the translation project. So we're very active in GNU in that way. But I said I will propose that we include the GNU into this purpose.
Thank you very much.
So I thank you very much for coming here today and giving a very interesting talk also to non-programmers like me. I guess that people are thirsty now. There are some refreshments outside, but on their way out, I'm sure they're allowed to buy even more merchandise.
Yes.
Are they? Yeah.
It's still for sale up there.
But thank you very much, Richard Stallman.